Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching World War I Part 5, 1918 by Epic History. So this is the last episode in their series on the First World War. Last time we had a lot of big events. The Russian Revolution, first and foremost. Russia drops from the war, the United States enters. The dynamics have sort of shifted. The momentum has turned against Germany, but the war isn't over yet. In this episode, of course, we will see how it ends, perhaps talking about some of the aftermath and long-term consequences of this conflict. Now, before we get into this one, I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. With all that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
After 3.5 years of war, the Allies are in crisis.
Yeah, I mean, Russia's dropped out of the war. The Eastern Front has essentially collapsed. That means that Germany and Austria, they can turn their attention fully, well, mostly fully, to the Western Front. That's definitely bad for the Entente powers, I won't deny it. But the Central Powers aren't necessarily doing great either. Germany, of course, is the main power we're talking about here, but they're now up against the industrial might of, both the United States, but also a lot of countries around the world. We saw a lot of different nations were getting involved in the last episode, and involved on the side of the Entente powers. Germany cannot match up to that. They, along with the European Entente powers, Britain, France, Italy, etc., they've been ground down by years of constant war, right? In terms of manpower, resources, industrial capacity. But now you got some fresh entrances into the conflict, right? So sure, Russia leaving the war is a big blow to the Entente powers, but, as I've said, the war is still going. It's not over yet. It could potentially go a variety of different ways. It's not like Germany stepped out on top. In fact, I think the momentum is more turning against Germany than towards it. Russia's gone, but there's a lot of factors that are not in Germany's favor. The United States being a big one, but not the only one.
Russia has been rocked by revolution, and its new Bolshevik government has signed an armistice with the Central Powers. Thousands of German troops will be freed up to fight on the Western Front, where the carnage of trench warfare has already claimed more than 1 million lives.
Jeez.
But Germany is also desperate.
Right, exactly.
Britain's long naval blockade has led to shortages and social unrest at home.
Exactly. Both countries tried to blockade each other. Germany also uses their U-boats, but as we saw last time, the U-boats have become a little less effective. The Brits and the Americans, using the convoy system, have managed to at least decrease that damage. So now, the blockade that's doing more damage is Britain's blockade of Germany. Right? They're starting to really need a lot of these supplies, especially food, that they are not necessarily getting. This is leading, of course, to military problems, but also an incredible amount of political unrest among the citizens of the country. And we just saw with Russia how that unrest among the soldiers and the citizens, that can lead to major issues, including revolutions or dropping out of the war. Right? So Germany, they're in a lot of trouble.
While America's entry into the war brings fresh manpower and vast resources to the Allied cause.
Right.
Germany faces inevitable defeat, unless it can win a quick victory on the Western Front.
Yeah, that's basically the position we're in. This has been a war of attrition so far, right? So both sides have been grinding each other down. But now if Germany wants to win, they're going to have to shake things up, right? They cannot continue this. Like I said, they cannot match the sort of industrial, economic, and manpower that is now being, or soon to be, used against them, particularly with the US. But like I said, there's also other countries involved. They need to win a big and relatively quick victory if they want to bring this conflict to a close. On their terms. The Kaiser's Battle. All right.
US President Wilson announces his 14 points.
Yep.
They outline his vision for a post-war world, including an end to secret treaties, a reduction in the size of armed forces, self-determination for the people of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and an international organization to settle future disputes.
Woodrow Wilson always thought pretty highly of himself. He's already got an eye towards the post-war settlement, right? And he's laid out exactly what he wants to happen. Now, once again, I could continue insulting Wilson, but, we'll turn an eye towards what he's actually aiming for. And these 14 points, they don't all come true. He pushes for some of them, lets go others, right? This is a negotiation following the end of the war, which we'll probably talk about in a little bit. But these 14 points do have a big influence. We're also really getting towards the start of the massive role the United States has in global politics today. Now, that had already been building up, particularly throughout the Americas, Latin America. The U.S. has done a lot of interventions already at this point. They're going to do a lot more, and they're getting more involved in sort of world politics and playing a big role, right? So this is a big step in that direction.
But most European leaders dismiss his ideas as wishful thinking.
Yes. Like I said, we're going to have a real negotiation after the war, and a lot of the countries, especially it ends up being the ones that he's allied with, are not interested in fulfilling a lot of the points he lays out because of the kind of peace they want to organize, but we'll get to that.
At Brest-Litovsk, Bolshevik Russia signs a peace treaty with the Central Powers. Russia gives up vast amounts of territory in exchange for peace. 500,000 German troops can now be redeployed from the east to the Western Front, where German General Erich Ludendorff plans an all-out, last-ditch offensive to win the war. Ludendorff's spring offensive catches the Allies off guard. German stormtroopers, using new infiltration tactics, help to overwhelm the British Fifth Army, which is soon in full retreat. The German advance threatens to split the British and French armies.
Yeah, and that is, of course, the goal. Now, years into the war, we are getting a bit of innovation. We're seeing, the lines really being pushed here. So far, it's been very stagnant. We've essentially been seeing a stalemate. Well, desperate, Germany said, okay, screw it, we're going to go for it. Of course, the goal is to split up the Brits and the French. You can take them on individually with all those German troops who moved over from the Eastern Front, right? That's the idea. And like I said at the beginning, the war's not over, right? We know how it's going to end, but there's still fighting to be done. Overall, I do think the momentum is against Germany, especially if the war lasts. But you can imagine in this moment, Ludendorff, the German high command, is thinking, if we can put this to a stop right here, if we can keep pushing, separate the Brits and the French, defeat them, this could all be over right now.
With disastrous consequences. So French General Ferdinand Foch is appointed Supreme Commander of Allied Forces to coordinate strategy. Outside Amiens, British and Australian troops improvise a defense and finally halt the German advance. The German offensive switches to the north, targeting the Channel ports.
And I will say, there is, of course, an incredible amount of history that's not being covered here, right? World War I is a massive conflict. There are a lot of different battles and events, and there's a lot of history to be done. I'm sure you can find videos and books and articles on each one of these battles that we do or don't go over, right? So there's a lot to be covered, a lot of really fascinating stories, but of course, we're doing sort of more of a broad overview here.
But the British inflict heavy losses on the Germans and prevent a breakthrough.
The dawn of air power. And I will say, as we're nearing the end of this war, as we're in 1918, I'd say we're beginning to see some aspects of the war that will continue on into World War II. Of course, World War I, World War II, there are significant differences. The First World War is so characterized by that style of stagnant trench warfare, but as we near the end, some of this air power, the tanks, some of the strategies we're finally seeing come to light, be innovated. Some of this is the kind of things we'll see, be worked on over the interwar period, and reintroduced as we enter into the Second World War, which is, of course, a very different conflict than the first in many ways.
Above the trenches, the First Air War continues to escalate. Each side now has more than 3,000 aircraft in service on the Western Front.
Damn.
But by 1918, the Allies have won air superiority, thanks to greater resources. On the 21st of April, Germany's most famous pilot, Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, is shot down and killed near Amiens. With 80 victories, he's the war's highest-scoring ace, and is buried by the Allies with full military honours. Britain's new
Of course, he is probably one of the most iconic figures from the First World War, extremely well known even today. A lot of history and stories about him.
Independent bombing force launches a daylight raid against Cologne. It marks the beginning of Britain's own strategic bombing campaign.
Right, I was going to say, I just talked about some of the things we'll see continued into the Second World War. We've seen sort of the introduction of air power in a military sense in a big way in this conflict. Not to say no air power was ever used before. We're mostly talking about sort of dogfighting in the sky, reconnaissance. Of course, we're now seeing a lot more bombing, and that's something that will be extremely important in the Second World War.
On the ground, Ludendorff's offensive switches south, targeting the French. German troops advance 30 miles, but are halted at the River Marne, just as fresh American divisions enter the line. The US 1st Division is the first to see combat at the Battle of Cantigny. 3 days later, the US 2nd Division wins victory at the Battle of Belleau Wood.
You see the Americans arriving. They're all fresh-faced, ready for battle. It's sort of interesting. Typically, you look at warfare, and the introduction of new troops, sometimes can be somewhat of a detriment, right? If you're talking about veterans versus new troops, sometimes those new troops don't have the needed experience. But also, and what we're seeing here, is that when you've got your veteran troops so exhausted, so demoralized, right, so low on supplies and tired, these new fresh-faced troops, they've got a massive, massive advantage, right? That's what we're seeing here. The American soldiers may not have the experience of the Brits and the French and the Germans. And in fact, that may benefit them. They don't have the harrowing experience in PTSD just yet. That might not actually be a benefit to the fighting. But they're also, they don't have the experience, but they do have a lot more energy. And they're coming in with a lot of American supplies and guns and all that sort of stuff.
By now, there are nearly 1 million American soldiers in France.
Wow.
With 10,000 more arriving every day.
Jesus! Okay, so we talked about, Germany being overwhelmed. We said that the Eastern Front ending, Germany was able to move over 500,000 troops to the Western Front. That's a big amount. Look how many Americans are already there. You can see Germany is being overwhelmed. There's no way they can stand up to the amount of manpower that's coming in.
The fourth phase of the German offensive leads to a 9-mile advance, but is finally halted by a French counterattack. In Italy, Austria-Hungary launches an attack at Asiago and the Piave River to support Ludendorff's offensive in France. But it's repulsed with heavy losses, and morale amongst the Austro-Hungarian army collapses. British and French troops land at Murmansk in northern Russia. It's the beginning of Allied intervention in Russia's civil war, on the side of so-called white or anti-Bolshevik forces.
And this will be the start of a massive, bloody, brutal, wide-scale conflict in and beyond Russia. And the Allies get involved on the side of the white forces, the anti-Bolshevik forces, a coalition of, those who are in favor of imperial rule, some sort of liberal types, some far right-wing types, right? You've got a combination. They're sort of allied against the Bolsheviks. This will be a very brutal and bloody conflict. Of course, in the end, the Bolsheviks managed to prevail. I mean, there's a lot more to say about that. You can talk about Trotsky. That is sort of outside the scope of this video, but is obviously definitely related as we see the Allied troops beginning to intervene here.
On the Western Front, the Germans' final attack is defeated in the Second Battle of the Marne. Ludendorff's offensive has cost the Germans more than 600,000 casualties.
Damn.
And has failed to make a decisive breakthrough. Germany's final gamble has failed.
Yeah, I mean, they pushed far, but they didn't manage to break the Allied lines, especially with the reinforcement of those new American soldiers. In the end, they use a lot of resources and manpower, get a lot of people killed, does not accomplish what Germany needs.
At the Battle of Amiens, British, Australian, Canadian and French troops, supported by tanks and aircraft, advance 7 miles in a single day. Exhausted, hungry and demoralized.
Exactly right. Germany's used everything to make this push. Like I said, the troops are tired, demoralized, hungry. The Allies, they've been holding the line. Well, they've been being pushed back, but they've been holding with these new, fresh American troops. They're able to push back, right? And the Germans just don't have much left to resist with.
Armies reach the Hindenburg Line.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about momentum throughout this series. Now the momentum is sort of irrevocably turned against Germany, right? They're not coming back from this. You know this is not going in their direction. Now, at that point, the question sort of is, all right, so how is this war going to end, right? Of course, the Entente powers have the upper hand. They're pushing, they can keep pushing. So how are we going to end this, right? That sort of becomes the question as it becomes clear that they've got the upper hand in the military side of the conflict.
A line of reinforced German defenses and break through. Ludendorff informs the Kaiser that the military situation is hopeless.
Yeah.
And that Germany must seek an armistice. Germany sends a request to US President Woodrow Wilson, who in return demands German withdrawal from all occupied territory and the Kaiser's abdication.
Yeah, Germany reaches out to the Americans because they rightly believe that they're going to get the best reception from the United States. This will be a theme we'll see throughout the sort of post-war negotiations, is that there's a lot of recriminations between Germany, Britain, France in particular. Germany and Britain Sorry, not Germany and Britain, France and Britain, France in particular, wants to punish Germany as much as possible. They want to be as punitive as possible. And so Germany sort of begins turning to the US like, come on now, help us out. I mean, we were just enemies, but you got to step in. Because, of course, Wilson has released his 14 points. He has outlined his vision for the post war settlement. And so the Germans are sort of like, uh-oh, we'd rather have that than whatever France has in store for us. So begin to see that here.
On the Italian front, the Allies deliver the final blow to Austria-Hungary at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. The Austro-Hungarian army disintegrates, and 300,000 prisoners are taken.
Wow.
With the Central Powers facing collapse, the Ottoman Empire signs an armistice with the Allies at Mudros.
First, we've seen the Russian Empire collapse. The Ottomans are going to collapse. The Austrians are going to collapse.
4 days later,
I guess, well, the German Empire is going to collapse as well. It collapses pretty hard. You know, I was going to say maybe a little less. I guess less than Russia. Doesn't necessarily break up in the way that some of these other powers do, but technically Imperial Germany ends. So a lot of empires collapsing as the war draws to a close and in the sort of immediate aftermath of the war.
Austria-Hungary signs an armistice with the Allies at Villa Giusti. At Kiel, the German High Seas Fleet is ordered to make a suicidal attack on the British Navy. But instead, it mutinies. Revolution spreads through Germany. The Kaiser abdicates, and a German republic is proclaimed.
Yeah, so this is where we see the German Revolution, right? Far less known than the Russian Revolution, perhaps because the Russian Revolution finds a lot more success than the German Revolution does, right? We do have the abdication of the Kaiser, the creation of the Weimar Republic, the short-lived Weimar Republic, frankly. We have this situation where there is rising in the streets, people rise up, the soldiers rise up, right? No one's happy with what is happening. But what occurs, I talked about the Social Democratic Party, I believe in the previous video, Germany's probably most powerful political party. They'd sort of been oppositional to the imperial government at the beginning of World War I. They'd sort of agreed, all right, we'll go along with this. We won't, disagree too much. We'll sort of put our concerns to the side, though this was a decision that caused fracturing within the party itself. Especially some of the more left-wing members were not really on board with this, but at the beginning of the war, the sort of pro-war sentiment was pretty widespread. As the war continues, it becomes less and less popular. The SPD, other German political parties, and leaders begin to speak up. Now, we're coming to the end of the war. We have revolution in the streets. The SPD, essentially led by Friedrich Ebert, he's sort of this moderate-type character. You have revolution from a lot of different people. You've got sort of the left-wing revolutionaries led by Rosa Luxemburg, and Karl Liebknecht. And what happens, essentially, is that Ebert sort of makes a deal with the old imperial apparatus, the military high command, things like that. He basically is like, all right, we'll keep a lot of you in your positions. We'll sort of keep a lot of the old imperial apparatus if you allow us, the sort of moderate social democrats, to create our new republic. To be fair, this is still a big shift from what happened previously, right? We've gone from an empire to a sort of liberal republic. And what Ebert gets in return is that he turns against the sort of left-wing members of his own movement. Liebknecht, Rosa Luxemburg, they are murdered by some of these Free Corps. We're talking about bands of soldiers in the streets, tended to be right-wing. Ebert sort of working hand in hand with a lot of these former imperial right-wing forces. And this is how we end up with the Weimar Republic. Not a very pretty start. A lot of violence, some betrayal. Of course, goes a different direction than the Bolsheviks, right? They sort of have their liberal revolution, then they have their socialist revolution. You end up with the USSR. Germany, they've got their leftist revolution, sort of gets crushed by a deal or an alliance between the liberals and the right wing, and they have their liberal republic, which is, of course, eventually overthrown by fascism, right? So that's different directions are gone, but that's essentially what we have right here. 1919. This is not a peace, it is an armistice for 20 years. Essentially correct. Yeah, basically.
The Paris Peace Conference opens at the Palace of Versailles, just outside the French capital. Delegates accept a proposal to create a League of Nations to settle future international disputes.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said about the Paris Peace Conference. Obviously, the most famous result is the Treaty of Versailles. But, a lot more happens here than just that. Your great powers of the era, particularly the United States, Britain, and France, these are your big three, but of course there are others involved, are sort of laying the agenda for world politics, right? They are sort of setting up the new global geopolitical order. Now, there are, of course, maybe not a lot, but there are several moments like this throughout history where a lot of big powers come together and sort of dictate how things are going to be. This is definitely one of them, right? So you get a lot of things resulting from this. Some very big, some relatively small, but look around the world, you can see the impacts of the Paris Peace Conference. But I think here we'll more be talking about the Treaty of Versailles. Of course, we do have the creation of the League of Nations, the sort of predecessor to the UN. The League of Nations, which the United States Congress votes not to join, even though it was Woodrow Wilson's idea. So the US is not a member of it, even though it was sort of their idea in the first place.
The Versailles Treaty, signed in June, imposes harsh terms on Germany. Its military is restricted in size. It must pay war reparations to the Allies. It loses territory to its neighbours. And its colonies are seized by the victors.
Yeah, this seems like a good time to talk about the consequences of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. I also want to talk about how the war is remembered today, but first, let's talk about Germany in particular, right? The Treaty of Versailles is quite punitive against Germany. Like I said, this is particularly pushed by Britain and France, especially France. They really want to punish Germany. Of course, there's been existing beef between these countries. France is sort of getting one back for the Franco-Prussian War decades prior, right? And so Germany, essentially has to constrain its military, loses a lot of territory, loses its colonies. Now, the way this all ends leaves a very sour taste in the mouth of many Germans. They're upset, both with the end of the war. Of course, you have this German Revolution. It ends with a lot of violence and betrayal. Now, this is the sort of origin of what is called the stabbed in the back myth, right? It's this far-right myth that emerges that essentially says Germany could have won the war if not for our politicians, communists, and Jews betraying us, right? Now, this idea emerges from the fact that the Allies, the Entente powers, push to Germany, and then they sign an armistice and sign the Treaty of Versailles, which is incredibly unpopular in Germany because of how punitive it is, right? The people feel betrayed by their politicians, and that's where this myth sort of comes from, right? And of course, the emergence of this far-right fascist movement, a lot of the blame gets shifted towards the sort of social democratic leadership who are identified as communists, even though a lot of them are not. and Jews, right? They become the target of a lot of this, and that will, of course, only grow in the years to follow, right? So there's this feeling of betrayal. Like I said, with this German Revolution, Ebert and the sort of more moderate Social Democrats kind of make this deal with the imperial apparatus to allow it to survive. What that means is that in the long term, it can sort of come back and reassert itself, a sort of powerful right-wing force. You have what are called Freikorps throughout Germany, essentially groups of very disgruntled soldiers who are angry and often violent, often quite right-wing, and can be mobilized by these growing right-wing movements, including the Nazi Party, right? So you can sort of see where all of this is building to, right? The conservatives, the right wing, still has a solid base of power. The leftists have essentially been crushed both by the right wing and sort of their own former allies. There's a lot of simmering resentment, both against the Entente powers and against people within their own country. This builds in a very bad direction, and that's really how you get the rise of the Nazi Party, the fascist takeover, of course, along with a lot of economic struggle, right? We see a lot of this during the Great Depression. So all of this combined is sort of how we get there. And of course, that is how we get to World War II, right? So that's sort of the aftermath of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles as it relates to Germany in particular. There's a lot more to cover, like a lot more, even just talking about Germany, but that's kind of a broad overview.
Germany must also accept responsibility for the war,
right,
in a war guilt clause.
This is one of the most unpopular parts of the Treaty of Versailles. Of course, people are upset about the material conditions imposed, but the fact that Germany has to accept all responsibility strikes many Germans as incredibly unfair, which I think it is, because it's not solely their fault. It's the fault of a lot of people in a lot of countries, but this only makes them more resentful.
A source of lasting resentment in Germany.
Right.
The boundaries of Europe are redrawn. Poland re-emerges after 100 years.
Like I said, after the Paris Peace Conference, we essentially see the establishment of a new global geopolitical order, right? And we can see that in Europe itself. We've got the re-emergence of a independent Polish state, which had not been in existence for a long time, right? Poland had been essentially carved up by its neighbors in the late 1700s. There had been a sort of quasi-independent state under Napoleon in the early 1800s. There had been Congress Poland under Russia, but it wasn't really independent. We finally have a new independent Poland for a short period of time, until Soviet domination.
Years of foreign rule, while Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and an enlarged Romania emerged from the ashes of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Look at that, Romania.
The Ottoman Empire is dismantled. New states, most under European control, are created in the Middle East.
Which is not what the Arab rebels had been hoping for, right? They had been fighting for independent states of their own. That's what had been promised to them by the Brits. But as we know, Britain had made a lot of promises, one of which was between them and France, and they'd agreed to carve this territory up, make it into protectorates, essentially colonies.
Here, as in Europe, the seeds of future conflict are sown.
Exactly.
While in the Far East, former German possessions in China are handed to Japan, to China's outrage.
Yep. China's pretty upset because they got involved on the side of the Entente, of the Allied powers. They were sending a lot of workers, they were aiding the war effort, and they feel outraged and also resentful that, their territory, which had been previously taken by Russia, is now being given to Japan. That they feel they've been done very dirty, which they have, of course.
World War I claimed the lives of 9.5 million soldiers.
Damn.
1 in 8 of those who fought. 21 million more were wounded. 7 million civilians also lost their lives. Huge areas of Europe were left devastated.
Yeah.
Old empires vanished. New states were born. lives across the world were transformed. The world was never the same again.
Nope. Alrighty.
If you
That was a good video series. I will just say at the end there, a little bit on the remembrance of the First World War, right? Just the discrepancy between the beginning of the conflict, the sort of glorious cheers as everyone got sent off to war, what would hopefully be a quick and valiant war, as that morphed into the discontent of the Long War, right? With all the death, destruction, all the horrific acts, all the PTSD, the starvation, right? All these things. And how the war is remembered today, right? It is remembered more as that horrific event, right? We have a lot of memorials. You know, we sort of recognize it as this terrible, in some ways, sort of pointless war where really not much was gained. Now, not pointless, like we know why it happened, right? I'm not saying that it happened for no reason, but that nothing was really gained from it, right? It was a loss of life for no good reason. I'll put it that way. There was a reason, it wasn't a good one, right? And that is sort of how we still remember it today. We remember it through the sort of horrifying stories, poetry, art of soldiers in those trenches, of the horrifying photographs, right? Not through the sort of valiant, heroic vision of war from the early conflict. I think it's really shaped in many ways how we view war today. And that is sort of, you know, that's very much how we remember this conflict. So it's just sort of interesting, I think, to see that discrepancy, how the war began, how it ended, and sort of how we remember it now as this terrible event that, frankly, victimized a lot of people. You know, of course, some people did heroic things, but then we more think of a lot of the people involved as victims, frankly, of events outside of their control, which is exactly what it was. So yeah, a good series. It's an older one by Epic History, but definitely a good one. I certainly enjoyed it. If you guys did, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. With all that out of the way, hope you guys are having a great day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.